So if you go to the workshop chat, there's a link in here, or you can just type it in if you want. And this just leads to the club webpage. We have a downloads tab. And then in here, this is where we post all of our workshop assets. So if we're ever doing any other type of workshop and we want to provide you guys with some starting materials, this is where you can download it from. And then for this one, this will be the Unity Space Shooters asset pack, which is for today. So if you download that, it's just a zip file. And then you'll have to yeah, if you just click on the link, it'll lead to here. You can download it. Okay. And then once you have it downloaded, if you right-click, hit extract all, and then we can use it for the workshop. Okay. So yeah, we're going to be doing Intro to Unity today, and I kind of wanted to show what the end product is going to be before we get started on it. I did make a build of it somewhere, I think. I apologize if the sound is loud. I don't know if it's going to be on there. I guess not. But this is what the tutorial is going to be on today. It's a Galaga clone, if you will, and we'll just have some basic user input, get a player that you can move around, as well as like different collisions and stuff, by being able to create some enemies that kind of fly down. All of the code and everything is provided, so that's from the website that you can download in the asset pack, and then we'll put it all together in Unity today. So, okay. So, without further ado, if you want to open up Unity Hub, if you haven't used this before, this is just kind of like a small application they made to help open different projects in Unity. And also where you like create new projects and stuff. So in this case, we're going to create a new project. And you'll see a bunch of templates that are here. A lot of them we won't use. There are some things like this karting microgame stuff down here where it's labeled learning. These are all like built-in tutorials to the editor. So if you ever want to do more after this, I would recommend these. They're pretty straightforward and they teach you most of the stuff we're going to cover today, but maybe some extra things that you might not get. Otherwise, select the 2D template since we are going to make a 2D game. This will just alter some of the settings in Unity for when you import images. It'll turn them into sprites right away, so you don't have to mess with any of that stuff. It just makes it a lot easier. You could always make a 2D game from the 3D template. It doesn't matter. It just makes it more convenient. And then I'm going to name it like Space Shooters or something for this tutorial. And then once you've done that, just hit the Create Project button. And then wait. The first time you make a project, it always takes the longest. It usually takes like a minute or so or longer depending on your computer. After that, it takes about half the time just to open up an existing product or project. Okay, so if your computer's still waiting, that's fine. Actually, I do have a couple things I want to talk about. I'm just going to give you a little tour around like all the different panels inside of Unity and kind of what they do. So this is the editor as a whole. I just picked the default layout, so hopefully this is what you're seeing if you've not used Unity before. But there's a bunch of tabs that you can drag around. You can customize this as you will, move things around if you want, but that might be more, you might be more comfortable with moving stuff around after you've gotten used to it. But there are different things. So the first view here is the scene view. This is where you can place down objects and stuff. You can edit everything within the world inside of the scene. In this case, there's a camera here, and that's the only thing in the scene at the moment, just because it's an empty project. And there's different tools and stuff that are in this top left corner. This hand tool just lets you kind of move around the scene, change your position. This move tool here lets you move objects around. The rotate tool lets you rotate, I guess. And there's a couple other tools too, scale tool, rect tool. They all have different situations when you want to use them. And usually Unity will auto-select them, so if you're using UI stuff, it'll auto-select rect. But we'll worry about that later. There's also the game view here, so this is just blue as of the moment. That's because there's nothing in the game yet. And this'll, if you hit the play button up here in the top center, it'll auto select the game view, so you can test your game pretty quickly. Okay, there's also the hierarchy. So this is just the list of all of the objects within the scene, within this view here. And like I said, there's only the camera as of the moment, but we'll be adding more objects to this in a bit. And then on the right side, there's the inspector. So when you click on an object in the hierarchy or in the scene view, it'll select it. And then in the inspector, this is where you can edit any objects. You can edit their position, rotation, different values, as well as other things they have added. So in this case, here's the camera data, and where you can change the background color to whatever you want it to be, and other things. But this is how you edit different objects so they can all be unique, etc., etc. Okay. So then there's also the project tab down here. This is where you can access all of the different assets and such. And with that in mind, if you open up the folder that we downloaded from the club website, inside of there are 3 folders: scripts, sounds, and textures. And these are all of the 3 folders that we need for the workshop today. So if you were to unzip the folder and then go inside of there, you can actually just drag and drop them into this project view down here, and it will automatically copy them into the project so we can use them. And then if you were to open these folders, like sounds, for example, now you can see all the different sound effects that are stored for the project, or textures. There's also the console here. Hopefully you won't have to mess with this much today, but if there's any errors or anything that are thrown, they'll pop up here, let you know what's going on. This is more prevalent when you get into scripting. There's a couple other things that we'll touch on quick that I think are important just to at least know about. If you go to Edit and then Project Settings, this is where you can edit a bunch of different things. Say that you want to change input for stuff, like you want to change what the jump button is. There's ways of doing that through here. Otherwise, if you go to the Player tab, you can actually rename the company name and the product name. This just changes the file location on the computer where the data is stored, in which case I'm not going to change this because it's a tutorial. But if you're making an actual game, you would want to change all this data, as well as the icon for the game and stuff like that. And then I'm going to close out of that. If you go to Edit, there's also Preferences, which I always get mixed up. And this is more stuff that directly relate to the editor itself. Like if you want to change the colors for things, you're more than welcome to. I'm not going to cover that right now. But like I said, it's just good to know about. Okay, so now we're going to actually start making stuff. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a folder. So if you click on the Project tab, right click, and then go to Create Folder, I'm going to call it Prefabs. And if you don't know what a prefab is, I can't remember what it's short for, but it's basically like an object that you, it's almost like a blueprint of an object that if you save it in the project files, you can drag it into the scene. You can have a bunch of them that are all from the same blueprints, the same prefab. And then when you edit that blueprint, it'll automatically update, or edit that prefab, it'll automatically update all of the like objects that you have inside of the scene. So this will be make more sense when we start making things. But say that you have like the spaceship, for example, if you were to change the color to red, it would automatically update every object to red, so you don't have to individually change all of them. And if you want to create a prefab, all you have to do is create the object inside the scene, and then you can drag it into the folder and it'll automatically create one here, have this blue icon unless there's a picture with it. I'm going to make the camera one for now because we'll be editing it and stuff later. Okay, so let's start making the player. If you go to textures, you'll see we have a bunch of different sprites here. And if you click on them in the inspector tab, it should have all of the data associated with them. A lot of this garbage we don't really care about right now. But we are going to change a few things. If you take the spaceship and you drag it into the scene view, you'll see it is very tiny. And that's a problem. So we're going to change that. If you select the spaceship sprite, you'll see that there is a pixels per unit field in here, and it's currently set to 100. And what this means is that every pixel on the sprite, there would need to be 100 of them for it to fill up the whole box. And so we want to scale it so it fills the whole thing. In this case, the resolution is 16. So we'll hit 16 and then hit apply, and it'll become bigger. But you'll see it's blurry. So to fix that, we're going to change a couple things. The filter mode, we're going to change it to point. And this just tells it when it's scaling the image up that we want an exact like color, not so it doesn't blend them together automatically. And then we're also going to change the format to RGBA 32-bit. And that's just good for pixel art for various reasons. But then if you hit apply after that, you'll see that it is now crisp and pixel art. And while we're at it, we're actually, if you select all the other objects, we're going to apply the same settings to all of those. Instead, so we just so we don't have to keep coming back to this. So 16 pixels per unit, point, filter mode, and RGBA 32. Now that we've done that, let's actually make the background really quick. So for the background, what we're going to do is basically place an object on the camera that just displays a bunch of space behind it, which is this space background image here, sprite. If you right-click on the camera in the hierarchy, you can go down to 2D, Object, Sprites, and then Square. And this will create a sprite, an image that we can render onto the screen. And I'm just going to name it background. And now you can see there's like a white box there. So we're going to change a few things. First thing is, if you see here on the right, the Sprite Renderer, you can change the sprite or the image that it is drawing or that it's displaying. So we're going to take the sprite background and just drag it into that box. And that'll change the reference image that it is using. But if you notice, it's not really much of a background. It's only like a little tiny box there. So if we want to scale it and make it much bigger, you have a couple options. The obvious one is just to change the scale on here. But if you notice, it just makes it bigger. We don't really want that because then there's only like a few giant stars and it looks kind of, well, not that it looked great in the first place, but it doesn't look any better. So what we're actually going to do is change the draw mode on the sprite renderer to tiled mode. And it throws a little bit of a thing. We can fix that here soon. But then we'll change the width and the height that popped up now for the size to 16 and 16, and that should be plenty of space to cover the whole camera. Because then if you look at the game view, for example, it shows, well, the whole background is now covered, so it has that pattern. If you want to fix this warning here, it just says like blah blah blah, it's not in full rect mode. You don't have to do this, but if you go to the inspector for the space background and you change that to full rect instead of tight, it'll just change some rendering options and then that warning will go away. It's not necessary though, but it might make a difference in some situations. Speaking of the camera, we're going to change one thing on the camera that I added. So if you make a pixel art app, if you've heard of the phrase pixel perfect, there are a lot of games that do that, especially pixel art. Kind of emulates like the old feel of video games where everything was pixel perfect just because that's how the engines worked. In this case though, Unity isn't pixel perfect, it just simulates it, fakes it, if you will. And the way that they do that is by using a pixel perfect camera, I guess. So if you select the camera object in the scene, in the hierarchy, and then see this button down here, it says add component. This is how you add different like scripts, different things that will change how the object works. Like for example, here's the camera. This is a component that has been added to this game object that tells it like, we want to use this object to render things to the screen. As well as the audio listener. This is another component that just tells Unity like this is where the player is, like where it hears audio from other objects, which isn't as important in a 2D game, but say if you're making a 3D game, for example, that's kind of important to know where your player is, because if you hear a sound behind them, then it knows how to like project that to the headphones of the user, so it actually sounds like it's behind them or something. So. But in this case, we want to add a component here called the Pixel Perfect Camera. So if you can search it if you want, just hit the button and then search like pixel. It should be the first thing that pops up. And hit enter. And then this will have a few options. We are going to change some of these things. So if you'll see here, it says pixels per unit. That's the same thing that we see on the sprite. And we change that to 16, so we'll also want that to match, just so everything is on the same page. It's all using the same pixels per unit values. And then this reference resolution is how many pixels are going to be displayed on the screen. You can change this to whatever you want, but for the sake of this tutorial, I'm going to be using 480 by 270. And if you are good at math, that's 1/4 of what the HD resolution is, 1920 by 1080. And that's just what my screen is, just so it aligns well. It might be different for other people, but that's okay. And then we're also going to check the upscale render texture, just for performance reasons, which don't really matter. But this just changes a few options in the Pixel Perfect camera that just make it more clean, I guess, so it's less likely to be choppy. So if you want to hit Control S, that'll save the scene. It is important to do that often. If Unity were to freeze or crash and you didn't save your progress anytime recently, anything in the scene will be completely undone. I've had that happen several times. Typically though, that doesn't happen if you're just making a simple game like this, or like a game jam game, probably won't happen to you. But it's always good to be safe. So now if you were to hit the play button, that'll just open that game view again. Why is it a square? Oh. So I think, yeah, okay, there we go. So if you want it to scale properly, the default is free aspect, and what this means is that when you play the game, it's just going to render it to whatever that box is that you have for the game view. But if you want to like simulate different resolutions, say that you're testing different things for different games with the UI, and you want to make sure that like the 4K Ultra HD is like properly set up. You can have it simulate that. It's not actually rendering that many, but it's like simulating it, so you can check different things. But I'm going to switch it to full HD, as that is what this reference resolution will fit into, and then it'll scale nicely in the editor here. But yeah, all we've got is a spaceship in the background, so we're going to actually give it some functionality. Okay, so if your spaceship is in the back, okay, so in the hierarchy, select the spaceship, and then we're going to be changing some sorting layers. So the sorting layers is how Unity decides what to draw or to the screen in front of the other. So we can create different layers, and they can each have different values that determine which order they appear in front of each other or behind each other. For 2D, the Z value doesn't really matter. It's all dependent on the sorting layer. So in the Sprite Renderer for the spaceship, under additional settings, there's sorting layer and order in layer. We're going to add a couple sorting layers that we'll use today, and then edit some other values as well. So if you hit the default option that says add sorting layer, we'll click that. It'll go to this tags and layers screen here. And then if you hit this plus button, add to the list, we can create new layers. We're going to be using 2 new ones, one of which we will call background, and the other one we're going to call foreground. Okay, and then once you got that, just click back on the spaceship over here in the hierarchy. And then if you go back to the sorting layer, if you click on default this time, it'll show the new ones that we added. So for the spaceship, we want to set it to the foreground. And then if you click on the background from that we added with the stars, go to those settings as well and change that to background. And then it should draw the spaceship on the screen. You should see it on top of the background. I'm also going to change the spaceship order and layer. I'm going to change this to 10. And the reason for that is because once we add like bullets and stuff, we don't want those to appear in front of the spaceship. We want it to be underneath it, just so it doesn't look weird. So the higher the number, the on top it'll be. So if the bullet is like order and layer is 5 and it's in the foreground, it'll appear below the spaceship. All right, now we're going to add a couple things that will are commonly used in Unity, a couple of components that will make this more of an actual object, something we can move around. So all physics, or not all, but most physics in Unity use a rigid body, and this is a component. So if you go to add component, rigid body 2D, this helps simulate everything when it comes to gravity, force, velocity, angular velocity, all the crazy things you learn in physics class that you probably don't know off the top of your head. Unity does all that, and it's probably one of the best game engines for physics. But we're not going to use it too much because this is a space game. There's not really any gravity. So once you add the rigid body, go ahead and change gravity scale to 0, since we are in space and there is no gravity. And then we're also going to hit the constraints drop down here, and then hit freeze rotation, just because we don't want the object spinning around, and this will just make sure that it's always locked in the same rotation that it's currently in. Did it fall down?
Yes.
Yeah, so yeah, make sure you change the gravity scale to 0.
Okay, yeah.
Yep. And that'll make it so there's no gravity, so it won't fall down. When I was testing this, I actually forgot to remove the gravity from the bullets, so when I started shooting them the first time, they would just like go up and then fall right back down. It's kind of goofy.
Will the ship come back or?
No. No, you'll have to hit the play button and stop it. That's a good point actually to bring up. So if you hit play, it'll start running the game. Why did it do this? All right, well, anyways. I don't know why it's rendering weird. Anyways, it'll start running the game, right? If you were to edit an object while it's playing, you can, like if I change this gravity to 1, the ship will start falling, whatever. But if you hit the play button again and stop playing, it doesn't save your changes at all. So if you were to edit a bunch of objects and like not realize it's playing, it's not going to save any of your progress. If you do want to save it, the only way that I really know of is to cheese it, is to copy the whole component and then paste it afterwards. Otherwise, it might just be good to write it down. But whenever you're changing stuff here in the inspector, just try to make sure that the game isn't playing, just so that doesn't happen. Okay. So after we get the rigid body, we're also going to add one of the scripts. So inside of this folder, there's a bunch of C# scripts that I wrote. You're welcome to look at them. I tried to comment to them. I got a little lazy towards the end, so the later scripts I wrote aren't so good. But if you want to ever create a script, you go to create C# script. We're not going to be doing that today. That'll be a different workshop. But this is how you write your own code for making things move around. And then once you write a script, it's in your project, you can add it just like any other component. So in this case, we want to add the player component, the player script that I had created, and it should pop up here and it'll have a bunch of things which we will fill out through the course of this tutorial. At the bottom, there's a couple things: move speed and shoot cooldown. Hopefully those are a little self-explanatory, but the move speed just controls like how fast it moves, the ship when it moves, and then the shoot cooldown is how long it waits between shooting. But we haven't created the bullets yet, so of course it doesn't really work. But before we do that, it has a bunch of references in here: renderer, collider, body, audio source. These are all different things that the script needs to be able to modify it. And so if we want it to tell it to use, or we want to have it move around, it needs a reference to this rigid body that we added, because it uses the rigid body to say like, oh, set my velocity to 5 so I can move to the right. And in order to do that, it needs a reference. So to give it that reference, you can click on and drag this into this box next to where it says body. And it should be the only one that allows. It has the X there. And then it should say Spaceship Rigid Body 2D inside of there. As long as you added a rigid body 2D. If you added just a normal rigid body, it's not going to work because that uses the 3D physics. So if you added that by accident, you'll have to switch it out for a 2D rigid body. And then one other thing we're going to add is it also wants a renderer, in which case we have a Sprite Renderer, and we'll drag that into there as well, just so it has access to it. But then once you do that, you should be able to hit play and move around. So if you hit A and D, that script is checking every frame or whatever if you're hitting A or D, and then it will move the spaceship accordingly across the screen. So you should be able to hit play and see it just kind of move back and forth. That's it for now, until we add more stuff. We're also going to add one more thing to this, another component that I forgot about. And this is a box collider 2D that we want to add. And this is basically the hitbox. So if you ever wanted to run into, like, collide with any other objects, Unity has a bunch of built-in hitboxes, built-in colliders for 2D and 3D, which are separate. The 2D has like a box, a capsule, a circle, an edge collider, which is just a straight line. You've also got other ones like polygons. So if you have like a complex object, like a dinosaur or something, you might want to use that. But in this case, we just need a box collider. It's pretty basic. I mean, the shape isn't too complex, so that'll do for what we're doing. And then once you do that, in the inspector for that, we want to change that to a trigger by clicking the is trigger checkbox here. And what this does is it changes it so the object doesn't actually run into other things. As once we start using bullets, we don't want the bullets to hit other bullets, for example. So if the is trigger isn't checked, it'll actually run into each other and they'll just like stop moving. Whereas if you have the trigger, it'll phase through them, and then we can decide through the code what it wants to do when it hits another object. So. All right. And then again, we'll also want to drag and drop that box collider 2D into the collider 2D field in here. Okay. All right, next we're going to add the bullet. Actually, first thing I'm going to do is move this down. Okay, now it's at the bottom of the screen. So I just changed the position inside of the transform here for the spaceship to -7, and that puts it at roughly the bottom of the screen, just so we have other space for the aliens to be up top. There we go. Okay, so now we're going to do the bullet. So if you go to textures and then drag the bullet either into the hierarchy or the scene, it doesn't matter. Oops. Then we can edit it and add components to it and such. So if you notice, it's behind the background again. So again, just to fix that, is you go to the Sprite Renderer, additional settings, and then change that sorting layer to foreground. And I'm going to change that number to 5. I guess the gizmo's in the way. This camera icon, if you want to remove it, you just hit this gizmo button up here, and it'll disappear. But if you make that disappear, then also removes like other things like the outline and stuff, like that wouldn't appear if you disable it. So. But here's the bullet. So we have a few things to add to it. Again, we want the bullet to be able to collide with different things like the spaceship or the aliens that we were going to add here after this. So we're going to want to add another box collider 2D. But if you hit this edit button inside of the box collider thing, it pops up with the bounds. If you notice, the box is really big, and we don't want a big hitbox for this tiny little bullet. So you can edit the values. Okay, so if you want to edit the hitbox, couple options. You can just drag these like boxes here if you want, and that gets you like kind of close. But like, it is just a number value. So if you look over here, it's like 0.008. If you want it to be exact, I do have the numbers. The offset should be, the X should be 0, and the Y should be -0.125. And that'll position the hitbox to be in the center of the bullet. And then if you make the size 0.25, and then 0.5, that'll make it so it pretty much fits the outline of the bullet. You can change this however you want. You can make it smaller, bigger, it doesn't matter. But this is just so when the player is playing the game and a bullet comes from the aliens or something, goes straight past them, like the bullet actually has to hit them as opposed to it just being close. Because if the hitbox is too big, just like actual video games, it wouldn't feel realistic. And then again, we also want to change that to a trigger as well, instead of normal collisions. So we're also going to go to the hierarchy here and then drag this into the Prefabs folder. And hopefully this will make Prefabs make a little more sense, since whenever we're not going to have like the bullets in this hierarchy here. Actually, once you make it a prefab, you can just delete it by hitting the delete key on your keyboard. Because we're going to have the spaceship create the bullet, and then the bullet's going to automatically move. Well, it will. Actually, we got to add one more thing to it. Okay, so after we make the prefab, if you go to the folder with that in the project down here, if you double click on bullet, it'll open up its own scene where you can edit this prefab, edit this blueprint of the object. And we want to add one more component to it that I forgot about, which is the bullet script. So if you hit add component, you can search bullet, and then it has a few references. It does want access to the rigid body, which we also didn't add. Okay, so you also want to add a rigid body 2D. And again, we don't want gravity, so it doesn't just fall, unless you want the game to be that way. And then you'll have to drag and drop that into the rigid body reference here inside that bullet script, so it can move the bullet around. And then everything else you can just leave. The speed, if you want to change the speed of the bullet, that's how you do it here. This again just controls how fast it moves. 15 I thought was a reasonable speed, so it's the default. And then once you're done editing the prefab, if you go back to the hierarchy on the left, there's a little back arrow here. If you just click that, it'll go back to the regular scene that we are working in. So to make it so we can actually shoot the bullet, if you click on the spaceship, once again, we can go back to the player script that is on here. And if you'll see under the prefabs header, it wants a bullet prefab. So you can just drag and drop that into this reference where it says game object, and then it'll say bullet there. And then now it knows when it wants to shoot a bullet, it's going to create an object in front of it, in which case now it knows which object to use, which is this bullet prefab that we have created. So once you've done that, you should be able to hit play. And then if you hit space, it'll shoot a bullet, and the bullet will just start moving up. And if you notice, if you move around, it shoots just in front of wherever the player is at the given moment. You don't have to select it that way. If you want to select an object, you can select it on the left inside the hierarchy list, and then say that it is like super far away. If you want to zoom up on it really quick, after you select the spaceship, for example, you hit the F key, which is short for focus. Oh, you got to hover over the scene with the mouse, and then hit the F key, and it'll zoom in to that object. Yep. And then if you want to like zoom back out or something, just hit like background and then F, it'll zoom out, see the whole background. So. All right, now we're going to add a couple sounds because this is boring without sounds. And Unity has another component that you can add to things called an audio source. So if you notice, I talked about the audio listener earlier. So in the camera, so everything has, there's always one audio listener, which is where the player should be. It should be attached to the player, or if it's a 2D game, like the camera or something, wherever's close to what the player is viewing. And then there will also be audio sources, and these are where the sound is projected from somewhere. Unity is some like crazy math or something with making it sound 3D. But in this case, it's just a 2D game, doesn't matter too much. But the sources should typically be applied to the object of like where it's coming from. So in this case, let's add a shoot sound to the spaceship. So the spaceship is going to be the object actually making the sound because it's the one shooting the bullet. So that's why we want to add the audio source here. So if you go hit the spaceship and then go down in the inspector, go back to add component at the bottom. We will add an audio source. And this will pop up here. There are a bunch of options. We're going to uncheck play on awake. Play on awake means like when the game starts, do we want to play the sound? The answer is no, because it's not going to shoot right away. We want to tell it when to shoot, and that's what the script does. But we also need to tell it the audio clip, so like what sound do we want to play? So if you go to the sounds folder from the assets in the project, there's explosion, respawn, and shoot. So if you click and drag shoot, you can drag that into the audio clip option here in the audio source. And then we will also need to drag and drop audio source into the audio source reference in the player script, just so the player script, the code, knows what audio source to use when you shoot, it'll play that sound. So after you've done that, you can hit play, and I don't know if it's going to work for me, but there we go. So if you hold down space, every time it shoots, it makes a noise. So that's how you add sound effects to things. If you want to do music, typically the best way of doing that is, again, another audio source, but then there's also like a loop option here. So you would click that because you want music to keep going over and over. Whereas in this case, the shoot sound, we just want it to play once, so we don't want it to loop. Okay. We're also going to add one more audio source here. This one is going to be for when the ship respawns. So in this case, we do want it to play on awake. We want it to play whenever the ship is created. So if the player dies, it will play the respawn sound. So in that case, you just take the resound or the respawn sound and drag and drop that into the second audio source on this object. And then this, all it does is just play the sound when the object's created, when the game starts, or when it respawns. It makes that sound. It does that. So, all right, one thing we're going to add quick. So if you go into the hierarchy, we're going to add the enemies, but first we're going to add a game manager. This is just an object that only has a script applied to it, and this just helps manage different things with positioning. Typically in most games you'll probably have one that, if you write code, that just does some, like, it just manages the game, controls different things. So if you go to hierarchy and right click, just hit create empty. This just creates like a blank object, and I'm just going to call it game manager. And then we'll add a component, which is also called game manager. Has a little gear icon. And then this also has some references to things. So the game manager is actually we're going to let it control respawning of the ship. So if the player dies, after we add the enemies, they'll be able to like get hit by stuff and die. We want the game manager to control respawning and only have a respawn after at 3 lives or whatever. So in order to do that, just like the bullet prefab, we need to make the spaceship a prefab as well. So if you go into the scene and click on it and then drag and drop it into the prefabs folder, that'll make it a prefab as well, since we're going to be creating it several times if the player dies. And then once you've made it a prefab, you can delete it out of the scene just like we did with the bullet. And then click on the game manager again, and then you can drag that spaceship prefab into the player prefab box here. We're also going to create another empty game object quick. And this is going to be called the player spawn. And this is just another reference for the game manager, so it knows where we want the player to spawn when it dies or when the game starts. It'll place it at that location. So in this case, we don't want the position to be whatever it defaulted to. I'm going to set it to 0, -7, 0, which will be down here at the bottom center. And then when the player dies, they'll respawn at that center point at the bottom. But just so the game manager knows about it, after you've created that, you'll have to drag and drop that into the player spawn box. And then after you've made the prefab, added it in there, as well as the player spawn, you should be able to hit play and nothing should have changed. It should look just like normal, but it'll do some extra work in the background once you're able to get hit by the aliens. All right, so next we're going to actually make the enemies, the aliens here. So if we go back to the textures folder, there is an enemy texture. I'm going to drag and drop that into the scene view, like we have with the bullet and the spaceship. Again, change that sorting layer. Foreground, I'm going to set the number value to 7. So 7 is in between the bullet and the spaceship, although it doesn't really matter that much. They're not going to overlap. But in certain situations, if you make your own game, you might want to change different values. So I'm also going to set the position to 0. So if you right click on transform, you can just hit reset, and that'll set all of it to default values. It's just an easy way to zero out the position and rotation values. Now we have this alien here. So now we got the enemy, but we also need to add all the different components that we have on the other objects, such as the box collider, so it can have a hitbox, hit the other objects, and rigid body, so we'll add that here now. So first I'll add the rigid body 2D. And once again, we're going to change gravity scale to 0 so the aliens don't just fall down. Yeah. And then I'm also going to add the box collider 2D as well. And once again, we'll change that to a trigger, just so the aliens, if they're moving around, they don't run into each other. They can phase through each other, since it is a trigger and not a normal collider. And then in addition to that, we will also add the enemy script. So if you add component enemy, you'll see a script that is here as well. And this controls, well, first it has some references to some different things, such as the rigid body. You'll want to drag and drop that into here, as well as the bullet prefab that we have created earlier. It also needs a reference to a bullet. You can set it to this bullet, but we're going to make a second bullet here after this, just because we want them to move like differently than the normal player bullet that shoots. You can just leave that blank for now if you want. That's fine. But yeah, make sure you drag and drop the rigid body into there. And then after that, we're going to turn that into a prefab, just so we have it in there. So if we create multiple enemies, multiple aliens, and say that we want all the aliens to move faster because we think they're too slow. If you have like a bunch of enemies in here, it'd be really annoying to have to change all the values one at a time. Whereas if you have the prefab, you can just change it in here and it will automatically update all of these according to whatever you do. So we'll just leave that one guy in here for now. I'm actually going to move his position to 7, so he's at the top of the screen. You can do the same if you would like. And then as long as you added the box glider with the trigger, if you hit play, you should be able to shoot the alien, and it should disappear. It might move on you right away. Oh, I know why it's not working. Alright, so it's not going to die. There's a reason for that. So since we changed all of the hitboxes to triggers, in the code, when it's shooting the bullet, when it collides with another trigger, it's got to know what it's hitting. In this case, it takes advantage of the tag system that Unity has. So if you click on any object, let's click on the enemy and hit tag. There's a drop down. There's a bunch of built-in ones that Unity has, like respawn, finish, blah, 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 player, which we're actually going to use player. But we want to add our own tags for enemy. So if you click on enemy and then, or actually, hold on, I take that back. Don't click on this one. Open the prefab in the prefabs folder by double clicking on it, or just click on it here. We want to edit this one, just in case we create different enemies that all have this tag. So you'll hit the prefab and then go to the tag, hit add tag, and that'll come back to this tags in the layer thing that we saw earlier. And we want to hit the plus button and then add a new tag. We'll call this one enemy. And we're also going to create another one called bullet, so we can apply that to the bullet prefab. There already is a tag, a player tag built in, so you don't need to worry about adding your own player tag. There's already one in there. So, and then you can go exit out of the prefab edit mode. Or I lied, actually. Go back in the prefab for the enemy, and then now we want to actually change the tag. So if you hit this tag button, it has the drop down. You should be able to see the new ones that you added. So we're going to set this to enemy, so it is an enemy tag. And then I'm going to double click on bullet. On the bullet prefab, change its tag to bullet. And then same with the spaceship, or the player. Edit that prefab and also change that to player. And then the reason why we're using tags, if you go back to bullet, sorry, I keep jumping around. If you go down to the bullet script, it says there's a text object or text setting in here for kill tag. So this is the tag that the bullet is looking for, and it knows, like, once it hits an object with that tag, it destroys it. So in this case, we want the bullets to hit the enemies and then kill them. So if you just type in enemy in here, it is case sensitive and stuff, so make sure you spell it correctly. Once you do that, then the bullet should work properly and it should kill the alien. Oh my gosh, that unfortunate. I didn't do enough debugging. Okay, well, it'll kill it after we do something. First, we're going to create the explosion, I guess, and then it should work. We're also going to drag in the explosion now, so it's in the same process. You can go to the textures folder and then just drag that into either the scene or the hierarchy. Change this to foreground. I'm going to make the order and layer like 20, just so it's in front of everything. And then this doesn't have anything special. It doesn't need a hitbox because it's not actually, the explosion is just going to appear quickly, like after the alien dies or something, or the spaceship blows up. It'll just flash this really quick on the screen, just for some pizzazz. So this also has a custom script called explosion. So if you add component explosion, that's all it is. This one doesn't need a reference to anything. All the code does everything in the background. And then once you've done that, we also need this to be a prefab. So we'll drag and drop that into the prefabs folder. Delete it from the scene, since we don't need it anymore. And then if you...
The scene too.
What?
Should we delete the enemy off the scene?
No, leave the enemy. Yeah, leave the enemy on the scene, just because if you want to make like a level, this is how you'll do it. You'll just have a bunch of them placed around. So the explosions, on the other hand, we want to spawn those in certain situations, or like the bullets, like only when you shoot. We don't want them in there to start with. So if you go to edit the enemy prefab, and then scroll down to the enemy script, it needs a reference to an explosion prefab. So we're gonna drag and drop that in there, and that should fix that error that just popped up in the console from the last time I played the game. So then now it has an explosion, so when it dies, it'll blow up. I hope it works this time. Yeah, there we go. So now when the bullet collides with the alien, it'll explode and die, and then it respawns at the top of the screen. Okay. If you just notice though, that when the alien flies down, it will go through here, as well as there are several players that keep spawning, which isn't supposed to happen. And that's because the player, the spaceship, if you go edit that prefab, it also, in the player script, it also needs the explosion prefab reference. So we can just drag and drop that into there as well for the player spaceship. So if you notice though, if the code runs into any problems, it'll just stop where it is. It doesn't break the whole game, depending on the error. But it didn't properly respawn the player, so it does cause some problems. Now that it has that, it should run fine. Okay, what is next? Okay, so we've pretty much got like the core part of the game done. This is like the minimum viable product, if you will, excluding the explosions. Those are a little extra. But we've got like the basic game. We've got a little player that can move around. You can shoot a bullet. You can kill the enemy. If you wanted to, you could create multiple of them and spread them around by just using this prefab. So if I want a second one, but that's at like 7-1. Oops, not Z1. I guess I'll put it at 2. Then when you play the game, now there's 2 aliens. So if you want to create like custom levels, that's how you do it. I'll let you have some experiment time here in a bit. I'll do the enemy bullet last because that's kind of optional. Have it that the spaceships shoot back at you. They should hit you though if they move down. Like if I'm here. Yeah, so if the alien runs into you, there are some invincibility frames after. But one more important thing to cover is the UI as well as the build settings. So there is one thing. If you want to create like a user interface, like have the health bar of the player, or in this case, we just want to display the score and the high score. If you go to the scene view and then you right click and create, or go to UI this time instead of 2D, it has a bunch of options. We just want a simple text object, not the Text Mesh Pro one. Typically you would use Text Mesh Pro because it makes the text more sharp and clear. But in this case for the tutorial, it's just easier just to use a text object. So if you do that, it'll pop up with the text here, as well as a canvas. So the canvas is used for all the user interface stuff. Anything that you want, like any buttons or displays in the UI, needs to be on a canvas. And then the event system here, this manages like button clicks and making sure that you can interact with it. I'm just going to drag and drop this event system onto the canvas so it shifts up, and then now it's part of the canvas. I just do that for organization purposes, but then it's part of the same object. But if you click on the text that we created, okay, you don't see it pop up there, there might be a legacy folder. Some versions of Unity hide it under there, just because they want people to start using TextMesh Pro normally. So if you don't see it here, there should be a legacy like folder somewhere, and then you just go another layer, and then there should be text there. So hit text, and then we want to add a component to this text object. And this is just high score display. And then all this does is shows the high score on the screen. So it needs a reference to this text object. So just like everything else, we'll drag and drop that into the references. But if you'll notice, we don't actually see it. If you hit or click on text and then hover over the scene view and hit F, it'll focus on it. And then now we can actually see the text. I'm actually going to focus on the canvas. There we go, the gizmos were gone. So as long as your gizmos are turned on, you should see this white outline. This is the outline for the UI. And the text is currently in the bottom left corner, which is, and it's like black or dark gray. And we want to change that. Since the background is dark blue, we're going to change the color of the text to white. So there should be somewhere down here in the text settings, you can change that color to white, so then it will appear over things. It's also pretty small, so I'm going to change the font size to like 36. Then you'll notice the text disappears. And the reason for that is because the box it is inside of is too small. So I'm going to change this to like 500 and then like 100 or something. Yeah. But then after that, then the size or the positioning is a little off just because we adjusted the size. So to fix that, you can actually change different things that like the anchor positions. And then this just determines, say that you want a health bar to always be in like the middle center of the screen, regardless of the screen size, the resolution. You can click on this button here and you can change that pivot point. So it always sticks to that point. So if you want like a crosshair, for example, you would have the pivot point be in the middle center so that it's always in the center of the screen. Or like a pause button would be in the top left or top right. I'm going to change this to the top left. Oh yeah, so make sure you change the size, the width and height to a big number. I just did 500 by 100. Or actually I might do 200. Yeah, if the text is too big, it'll just like disappear. So you gotta make sure the text size is big enough. I think with TextMesh Pro, it just wraps down, but yeah. And then after you do that, we're gonna change the pivot options here. I'm gonna change the pivot to 0, 1. And what this does is it changes the position value so it corresponds to this top left corner of the text, because then you can change the position to 0, 0. And as long as the pivot is 0, 1 and the anchor is the top left corner that is selected here, it'll appear in this top left corner if it's 0, 0. So then we have the text up there. As long as you created or added the high score display text component, or script, as well as added, drag and drop that reference into there. If you hit play, it should have some text up here that displays like your high score, what your current score is, and then how many extra lives you have left. And this is all stuff that the code is changing every time the player like shoots an enemy. The score will go up. If the player dies, an extra life will go down. Other things. If you look through the code, you can see how that all works. It does save the high score in the player prefs, which is just like a cheesy way to save data like high scores for like a game jam game or a quick project you're making. I wouldn't recommend it normally because it's not very It's very easy to hack into. I think it's just a raw text file somewhere. But if you notice, if you hit play and then you stop playing, your high score will retain whatever it was over different play sessions. So, all right. We have one last big thing to talk about, and then I'll go over the player bullets since those are more like optional since we are running a little short on time. And this is like how do you do multiple scenes or multiple levels? Typically, so right now we've been working in one scene. I'm gonna hit Control or hit F on this camera, focus into the camera. But we've only been working in one scene, so we have one level where there's like these aliens on the screen. Everything's in here. It's all fine and dandy. But say that we want to have multiple levels. So we have like, you know, these two aliens on the screen. I'm going to make a third one just for the example here. We've got 3 aliens on the screen. But then we want, after you kill these aliens, we want there to be a second level where you have like four or 5 or something, or different colored aliens. We'll want to create different scenes for each level. So what I'm actually going to do is go to the scenes folder and then rename this to level 1. And it'll ask you if you want to reload the scene. You hit reload and it'll rename it here quick. And then to create a second one, all I'm going to do is duplicate this scene. So after you've selected it in the project folder, you just hit Control D and it will duplicate it. And then you can double click on it to open it. And if you look in the hierarchy, it'll say level 2 now, as it should have automatically changed the number value. And it should look exactly the same since we just duplicated it. But if I want to create more enemies, you can also select them and Control D to duplicate. So for example, I added another row here. And so this will be level 2. It does, the game manager does some fancy code in the background for loading all of them. But in order for it to know which ones to load, we got to do one thing quick. If you hit File and then Build Settings, it'll have this window pop up. The build settings just control, well, there's not really much here, but this is where you add different scenes so the game knows which ones to add to the final product. So if you convert this, or if you build it into an actual executable like an actual game, it knows which scenes to use. Just so if you're making an actual game, maybe if you have like a testing scene, you don't want to add that to the final product of the game. So you don't add it to this list. But I'm actually going to double click on level 2 and open it. And then inside of these build settings, if you double click on level 2 and you add it, add open scene, it'll appear in this list here. And then it is pretty much done. If you hit the build and run in the bottom right corner, it'll ask you for a folder of where you want to build the game, put all the like the output, the exe and stuff. I'm not going to put it. I don't know. Where is my folder? Yeah, so if you just create a folder somewhere in your computer where you want to save the files, hit select folder. After you hit build and run, it'll build the game really quick, turn it into an executable file that you can share to all your friends. It'll take a little bit. Usually it takes, for a small game, only like 15 seconds or so. And then it'll start playing it for you. I don't know why the camera's all goofed. It's probably something I overlooked. But now, if you can, as you can see here, it has the level 2, so it has those 6 aliens that I had created. And then after I defeat them, it'll go back to level 1. The game just loops over and over. But there is, if you hit R, it'll restart the game, or if you hit escape, it'll close it. that's all the basics. I did skip the enemy bullet. So say that we want another bullet for the enemy to shoot. Because it'll spawn bullets and it'll shoot down randomly. We can drag and drop this bullet prefab into here, but you'll notice a couple problems if you hit play. First of all, the bullets are really fast, and second of all, they can shoot themselves. But the bullets will phase through me. And that's because the bullet prefab is looking for the enemy kill tag. So we have to use a separate prefab for the enemies to use instead of using the bullet that the player shoots. So in order to make a different version of it, I'm going to drag it into the scene. And we'll make a couple adjustments. In the bullet script, we'll just change this to player, so it's looking for the player. And I'm also going to change the speed to 7, so it's not as fast. And then you'll just drag that back into prefabs, make it a variant. It'll ask you if you want to make it original or variant. We're going to make it a variant, just so it's still using this bullet as a base, but then it has a couple differences, but they are the same object. And then I'm just going to rename this to enemy bullet. And then we'll go back into the enemy prefab, drag that new enemy bullet into the bullet prefab spot, and now they should shoot down and kill the player as well. So, yeah. There's one thing we're missing that I forgot to add. It's not really necessary. But the explosion also has an explosion sound effect, so if you want to add an audio source to the explosion prefab, keep awake on play, or keep play on awake turned on, and then I'll drag and drop the explosion sound into there. And then when the explosion spawns, it'll make a sound as well. I don't know why it has, oh. I forgot to delete this bullet. But that's pretty much it. Now we've got somewhat of a finished project for a tutorial. If you want to create multiple levels, you'll just do the same thing with the scenes. You'll have to, easiest way is just to duplicate one and edit it. And then you'll have to go to the build settings every time and add it. So it'll cycle through. That's pretty much the whole tutorial. I don't have anything else to add.